In this tutorial, we're going to continue to look at becoming a communicator. Two of the most important skills needed for language and culture acquisition are listening and observation. The most successful learners spend a lot of time early on just listening and observing. Listening to the sounds, tones, and stresses of the language, and also when and how people are speaking, and carefully observing what is going on around them. Both of these skills may seem like passive activities, but in fact they require thought and discipline and even take some practice to become good at. Most people are not naturally great listeners or observers, so we will be looking at some of the ways to practice these skills even while you are still in your own cultural setting. Dr. John Klein writes this: "Hearing is passive, listening is active. Understanding the difference between hearing and listening is an important prerequisite for listening effectively." In the Yanomamo tribal language, Jiliao means to hear, and Jiliblau to listen actively. This recognizes the fact that hearing and listening are actually two different activities. In the last tutorial, we talked about communication landscape and identified the components of interpersonal communication. We saw that there are many more contributing factors to clear communication than only words that are spoken. So it follows that when we listen, in order to learn how to communicate, we probably shouldn't just listen to words. David McNeil says, "To study language by listening only to utterances is to miss as much as 75% of meaning." It's been said that communication is 7% verbal, or words, 38% vocal, the volume, the pitch, the rhythm, the tone, and the stress, and 55% body movements, mostly facial expressions. The fact is that we typically retain, for a few minutes, only 65% of what is said to us. And 2 months later, our recall is down to 25% of what we were told. Why is this? We look at some of the common barriers to good listening. Most of us still recognize at least some of these bad habits, either because we have seen them in others or we may have done them ourselves. Constantly comparing yourself to the speaker. Who is smarter? Who's had it rougher? This is too hard for me. Trying to mind read what the speaker really thinks. He probably thinks I'm stupid for saying that. Planning what argument or story to give next. Filtering so that you hear only certain topics or don't hear critical remarks. Judging a statement to be crazy, boring, hostile before it's even completed. Or daydreaming. Remembering your own personal experiences instead of listening to the speaker. Busily drafting your prescription or advice long before the speaker has finished. Considering every conversation an intellectual debate with the goal of putting down the opponent. Believing you are always right so you don't need to listen. Quickly changing the topic or laughing it off if the topic gets serious. Placating the other person by automatically agreeing with everything. So what are the qualities of a good listener? Typically, we all practice good listening some of the time, especially if we are interested in the topic or genuinely want to get to know someone better. These are attitudes and skills we need to become aware of to begin to practice and to seek to do more automatically. Because to become a good communicator, one of the first steps is to practice active listening as a skill, attitude, and eventually as a habit of life. These are some characteristics of a good listener. Pays attention, is attentive and active, not focused on formulating responses. Listens with objectivity to discover what the speaker thinks. Doesn't transfer preconceived personal beliefs to the speaker. Does not judge the speaker before hearing him out. Verifies understanding and only responds after understanding. restates key points to affirm understanding and build further dialogue, summarizes key points to affirm understanding and build further dialogue, asks non-threatening questions to build understanding. Marilyn Vos-Savant says, to acquire knowledge, one must study, but to acquire wisdom, one must observe. Observation is something we do all the time as a natural course of life. But if someone intends to learn how to relate naturally in another culture, observation needs to be a skill that is honed and developed. Often, there are insights into culture that we can miss if we don't actively observe patterns of behavior and try to fit those into a framework to understand why people are doing the things we see them doing. Observation is one of the primary methods of gathering information for someone in the early stages of cross-cultural learning. It is particularly valuable because it helps someone to view actual behavior, rather than socially pressured or conditioned statements. For example, think about what you might answer if someone asked you, "What time do you get up in the morning?" You would probably give a single time that is an ideal, or an average of the time you usually get up. Now think about the picture someone would get if they were able to observe your morning routine for 2 weeks. Would the answer that you gave initially be true all of the time or most of the time? Do you get up at the same time on weekends as weekdays? Observing behavior rather than just asking a question is the difference between the ideal and the real. What people say and what they actually do can sometimes be different, and you can get a better picture if you are carefully observing. People who are astute observers often end up being more natural participants in the culture because they have learned how local people behave, have seen the gestures they use, noted the facial expressions, and the tone of voice that is used in different circumstances. Naturalness is important to clear communication because it allows people to listen without being distracted by the confusing messages given by unusual behavior. Of course, later on, when a person can speak and understand the language more fluently, they will be able to investigate more deeply the motivation for certain behavior and gain more of an insight into a person's thinking by talking to them. But the observation will always be an important part of the understanding of what is going on. Good observation is simply noticing the details. The physical location. What is the setting? What kind of situation is it? The human interactions. How many people are involved? Who are they? How are they related? The communication. What kind of communication is taking place? Who is communicating to whom and how? Timelines. What is the sequence of events? Was something going on before you arrived? Or questions. Write down any questions you have that come to mind for future reference. Practice is necessary to become a good observer, but there is a lot of opportunity to practice. It is a good thing to seek to develop a healthy curiosity about what is going on around you, and to notice the details in a situation and in people's behavior. You will have plenty of opportunity for observing and for learning from people as you develop relationships with them. Observations should be mere statements or fact. They record what the observer sees, but they do not contain an explanation or assign any meaning to what is observed. As such, they do not, or at least should not, involve any interpretation. Interpretations assign meaning. To interpret the facts, they involve conclusions or judgments. These interpretations inevitably come from the observer's experience of what the observed phenomena means in his or her culture. But if the person doing the behavior is from another culture, then that behavior may very well have a different meaning, with the result that the meaning assigned by the observer may be very different from the meaning intended by the doer. It is natural when observing a situation to interpret what you are seeing and to come to a hasty conclusion about the motivation of the people involved. Because in our own culture we are able to base these conclusions on things we know about, the typical ways people behave, and what that behavior probably means. However, we need to be careful in another culture to actively practice not coming to quick conclusions and to keep an open mind about what is really going on. We do have to interpret or make sense of the things we see and hear, and we do have to decide what they mean. That is a normal function of daily life. So you should interpret what's going on around you, but you should know that when you interpret across cultures, you may sometimes be wrong. You can't be sure of your interpretations, at least not until you understand the host culture better. We will look at some examples of observation as opposed to interpretation. Here are some pairs of statements. In each case, one of the statements is an observation or a mere description of the facts or behavior that you are witnessing, and the other is an interpretation, your explanation or opinion of what these facts or of what the behavior means. In the first column of observation, we see that a man is talking quite loud. Our interpretation might be that man is very angry. That family dresses very well when going to town. The interpretation may be that family is wealthy. That woman always wears a veil when she goes out in public. We might think that woman is quite conservative. That woman never makes eye contact when she speaks to me. We may interpret that as that woman is cold and reserved. That man never contradicts his boss in public. And we may interpret that as that man is afraid of his boss. She never speaks up in meetings, may be interpreted as she doesn't have strong opinions. That worker never does anything until he is told, may be interpreted as that worker is lazy. She said yes when the real answer to my question was no. We may interpret that as she lied to me. They never show affection in public, may be interpreted as their marriage isn't going well. And he yelled into his phone and used short, pointed sentences, may be interpreted as he's very aggressive or angry. As you look at this photo, I will read some statements about the scene in this photo. Note whether each statement is an observation or an interpretation. The woman is standing in a group looking at something. One of the woman's children is sitting nearby. The man is annoyed and wants me to go away. The walls are made of mud brick. The man is interested in me taking a photo. The man is drinking a Coke. The people are standing outside their home compound. The women are waiting for something to happen. The little boy is on his own board. All women must cover their heads and wear long trousers. The house roof and wall is damaged. There are ladders going up to the roofs of the buildings. The women are wearing brightly colored clothing. Here's the list of statements that I just read. Remember that observations are based on facts rather than interpretation.